Morning, everybody. It's exciting to be here at BSides. It's always great to be the first talk of the day because it will be the best talk you've heard yet today, unless you've been watching some old talks on YouTube or something. At 10:01, that probably won't be true. So this presentation is something I've been working on for a while. It's not the exact same presentation I've given before, but it's similar in concept. And the title is obviously Why You Don't Need a Security Team. And of course, what does that mean? And part of it is, to be honest with you, it's just provocative. It gets people going, right? Like Blades of Glory. But perhaps a better title is kind of rethinking security teams and what they look like. And, you know, one of the things, I give a lot of presentations, is I think a lot about presentations. And a lot of the feedback comes down to people's introductions are kind of terrible because they talk about themselves a lot. So I always think about the intro being is, why should I listen to that person standing up there? And for me, it's that I work for a company called TrustedSec. I've been there about 11 years. Prior to that, I worked at a software startup, and before that, I did security consulting as well. But what I do every day is work with organizations, really from sole proprietorships to the Fortune 10, to assess and build information security programs. So I just see a lot, right? I think they said they sold over 1,000 tickets. So I'd say there are probably at least 900 people here that are smarter than I am. But I've seen just many different things and many programs. I love this slide because how often do you see the front and the back of someone's head? Right? It's pretty rare. Maybe certain changing rooms at Macy's or certain medicine cabinets that may happen. And also staff who I work with is also here. She's based in Pittsburgh. But really, to start with the conclusion, I read this whole thing that with presentations, you should start with the conclusion and then kind of work your way to it. But my view is not that we shouldn't have security teams or that desktop support should be running pen tests. It's just that so many of the things that we traditionally think of as security functions can also be distributed across the general IT function with support from governance and direction. So it really, in short, fewer security people and more people doing security. So this is something that I see quite often at organizations. When you talk to people that are in IT roles, are getting really smart with security. They're doing a lot of the security functions and roles. And additionally, I know this is really unpopular. People get mad at me when I say this. But just based on what I'm seeing, I think future CISOs are more likely to be a lawyer or an MBA than somebody that has been a hacker. And that's based on a number of things I'll talk about. Don't hate me yet. It's fine to be annoyed about that. But I think once we talk through it, it's going to make some more sense. So with that being said, that's the gist of my presentation, right? Sorry, so no laughter, so I know what the audience is. That's good. But really that's fundamentally my point. That much of what we think of as security functions can be distributed across the organization, and that in the future, just given how much compliance and contractual and business issues we face in security, that likely in the future it's going to move that direction. So if the track one seemed more interesting, then now's probably the time to head over there. So that being said, every organization is so different. And what's fascinated me over my career is that even two organizations that seem to be exactly the same on paper, right? So they're in the same business, same size, same revenue, what have you. They still are often extremely different. You'll have very different skill sets, you'll have very different goals, different risk tolerances, and so on and so forth. So it is tough, I think, with broader strategy things and broader governance. It can be very tough to really come up with something that's going to work for everybody. But we'll talk about a number of themes, I think, that are true across industries, across organizations, and across people. So one of the things that I've really noticed, and I think probably all of us in this room have, is how specialized things have gotten. I was at a conference a year ago, and I went into the vendor hall, and there were hundreds of vendors. And I had heard of, I don't know, maybe 20% of them. And if you had gone to the same conference 10 years ago, you would have known who everybody was, right? You would have understood and kind of maybe not had a deep technical knowledge of each of them, but we would be familiar with all those technologies. And now things are just becoming so specialized that it's so difficult for any one person to really understand all the domains at a very deep level. And so I think we're seeing a split where there's very deep domain experts and then a lot of generalists as well. We still run into utility players, obviously, but when you think about the people that you know or your organization, obviously, if you think about it, there's a lot of different skill sets, different abilities, and things like that. I believe still that a lot will end up continuing to be outsourced. Of course, take that with a grain of salt. You know what I do for a living, right? I'm a consultant. If I come to your house and say that your windows look terrible, and then you ask me what I do and I sell windows, fair enough, right? But when you start to think about the different skill sets and how large an organization may need to be to have all these different, very deep skill sets, a lot of things I think are going to continue to make sense to outsource. So another topic, how much do we hear about the cybersecurity skills gap? A lot, right? I'm going to answer my own questions, right? So, but what I see a lot of is more of a misalignment, right? Because we haven't necessarily across the industry or across organizations really defined what cybersecurity jobs are. And when you think about IAM, or you think about things like firewall management, right? So is the person that's doing the settings, is that a security role if they're not the ones defining what those settings should be? And again, just in my own experience, being fortunate to work with a lot of different organizations, just seeing a lot of examples of people that don't have security in their title, but they're in IT, who are becoming very well versed in security. Another thing too is really when we're executing, is that if I install brakes, does that mean that I need to know how brakes work 100%? Right? So when I go down, so the person that maybe is the engineer, working at the auto company or the brake company, is probably going to have a different skill set than the person that's installing brakes down at the auto shop. So thinking in terms of what skills are in short supply. So the bulk of the presentations that I give are outside of the security industry. I was actually in Chicago yesterday presenting to an insurance organization. And just as an aside, it seems like every time I come to Pittsburgh, I'm always somewhere else earlier in the week. So I actually flew home last night and then drove out here from Cleveland at 5:30. So my talk's really sponsored by Red Bull. But at these conferences or at these meetings, people will oftentimes ask me after. They always say that they have a kid or some that wants to get into security, and they always want to be a pen tester. Right? Everyone gets really excited about that. Well, I love GRC. I have always loved GRC. But there's, in my experience, no shortage of people that want to be pen testers. Yet, when you talk to organizations, there's a huge shortage of people that are pen testers. And I have a lot of friends that are really good at pen testing or technical skills who are looking for jobs. And I know it's incongruous, and I don't have an answer for that. But I think it's important just to think about those things and what does that mean to the industry. It doesn't necessarily prove a point, it's just how weird things are right now. But in my experience, again, just with what I see, is that the largest gap really is people that are able to design programs and understand how to implement them. So another piece, when you talk about, can we all agree on what a CISO does? Right? There's no real definition. I have a friend I went to high school with, and he's a really great guy, and he must do well because whenever I see him, he's out in a boat or doing whatever. But he's always jumping around to different multi-level marketing things. And I'll talk to him, and I'm like, oh, what do you do? He's like, oh, I'm the CEO. I was like, oh, awesome. And I'm like, how many employees do you have? He's like, I don't have any, right? And so, even that role, but when you start to think about a CISO, is that some companies, right, you work at these large companies, have large teams and are working on strategy, versus sometimes we get assigned that title because we have to have one for some regulatory reason, and, maybe more strategic, or maybe actually laying under desks, plugging things in, right? What I see a lot of organizations really looking for utility players. I don't know about everybody here, but I'm signed up for every job alert there is, right? And Dave, who owns the company, if you're watching, it's not because I'm leaving. It's because I find as a consultant, it's a really great way to see changes that may be coming at clients you work with. Or if you're in consulting yourself, it's a great place to mine for leads. Because if a company's hiring for a bunch of security people, guess what? They're thinking about security. Maybe it's time to call them. So if you take nothing else away from that, maybe that can, if you're in sales, help you a little bit. But again, what I see as expectations are just grossly misaligned. It's unbelievable how different the job descriptions are for just about every role in security, which I think kind of supports the case that we need to rethink how we're looking at security overall, especially from a governance perspective. So society is built on specialization, right? So we're going to have lunch today. And if you look at, I don't even know what lunch is, but let's say it's a sandwich, right? So we just go and buy a sandwich, or we just go and buy bread, or we go and buy meat. But what if you had to do all the steps to get all those pieces, right? We have someone that grows wheat. We have someone that makes bread. We have someone that raises animals. I've got a bunch of chickens at home. But it's become more and more specialized, right? So just about every industry, just about every role has become more specialized. And I also see security moving that way as well. For a long time, remember, I mean, if you've been around for a while, security used to be really off to the side. It was something that was very specialized knowledge, but now security seems to touch everything, right? Even a lot of the tools we use have kind of become careers. You have people that are experts in certain tools or certain technologies, and that's their specialty, and that's what they do, right? They work with that tool. They work with that technology. They don't necessarily work on the overall strategy. So people tend to get mad when I say this, but in the old days, right, and I don't know exactly how long ago it was, but you could pick up an encyclopedia and really understand a lot of what humans knew at the time, right? So maybe in the 1800s. It's funny because I was a horrible student, and I'll just tell you I'm 46, which is like a weird thing because I'm on the cusp of when I was in high school we had card catalogs, but also sort of the internet that took, I don't know, I remember like 3 hours to like download a picture or something. And so I always did everything at the last minute. And so I would write my papers the night before. And we had a Funk and Wagnalls encyclopedia that was purely for decoration on the shelf growing up from like the 1890s. And I used to use that to write my papers. And I got in a lot of trouble for that because everything was always wrong. My whole paper about how the sun revolves around the earth. But I feel that's very similar to what we see in security. As I said, just think back to 10 or 20 years ago. It was possible to really understand all the different domains and have a really good handle on it at a pretty decent depth. And now that's becoming more and more difficult, right? So somebody who's an expert on compliance versus someone who's an expert on cloud versus somebody who's a pen tester or applications or what have you, it's becoming more and more specialized. And then, continue to move along, how do we even define security, right? And security with a capital S. So a security team or a security program. Everybody hates documentation, but do you have a security charter, right? So have you defined what your security team or what your security program is setting out to accomplish, right? And think about all the different roles security can have, whether it's at your organization or just in general overall. Are you there to advise, right? So do you come up with the standards or do you give direction on what should be in place? Or are you just consulted about that? Do you make recommendations or do you make rules with the force of law? And then even thinking about testing, right? So are you the one that's testing the controls or is that audit? Are we designing or are we implementing? So at organizations, do you have a security team that's designing what goes in place but doesn't necessarily touch the systems? Or are they doing both? And sorry, I look around the stage. So I think it was about 8 years ago, I fell off the stage at a Federal Reserve branch. And it was a little bit higher than this. And my wife, now wife, who was not my wife at the time, was in the audience. And I just pretended like I meant to do it and went and tried to take questions. But now people bring it up all the time. Like whenever I run into people in Cleveland, like, oh, remember when you fell off the stage? I'm like, yes, I do. Thank you. Like, what else do you want to bring up? What I did in 4th grade? That was also embarrassing. But also just thinking in terms of, building versus running. We have a lot of conversations about this with organizations because most organizations are staffed to run what they have, right? So does anybody in IT work like 25 hours a week and then go golf? Right? People are working 40, 50, 60 hours a week. They're constantly busy, they're constantly working, and they don't necessarily have time to build and implement the new things. So when we build and look to implement new things, what happens? Sometimes we fall off on the things that we're trying to keep running. And another big thing and a big topic that we look at all the time is existence versus effectiveness, right, when we're testing a security program. So I used to, a long time ago, be a QSA, so with PCI. And in the old days, if you deal with PCI, you may remember that it used to say you had to have a web app firewall, right? But you could have that web app firewall, and it could be set with any rules. But if it was there, all right, my responsibility is to give you a green check because it exists. But it didn't look at the effectiveness, right? And so that's another conversation that we're having a lot more often, and I think it's becoming a lot more important, right? So not just looking at whether or not the controls are in place, but are those controls effective to buy down risk in the way that we intended? So another fun topic, right? We've always had this conversation. People used to talk about InfoSec versus hackers, and what's the difference? What does that mean? I used to always get told, not anymore, but that I was the youngest person they'd ever met that did GRC. Or people would always make jokes about where's my tie, right? When I'd ask questions about compliance, because I work with a lot of very technical people. But when you picture a hacker, what do you picture? Versus when you picture an information security professional, what do you picture? Versus governance. There's no governance scene, right? Anybody ever seen like iRobot or Mr. Robot? Right? I mean, where's Mr. Governance? Right? I mean, where's a movie about somebody rappelling out of a helicopter and helping you write a policy? I mean, I would watch that. It might not do well. Or Mr. Checkbox. And so it's just not necessarily something that I think people get as excited about, but for me, it's an extremely important topic. Anybody here work in governance? Yes, all right, so we're well represented. But another conversation that's becoming more common is even, where does security sit? This has been a thing for a long time. People have oftentimes talked about, where should a CISO report, right? Should they report to the CIO? Should they report to the CFO? Should they report directly to the board? And while we were having those conversations, I think a lot of things have shifted. And you're starting to see, as I mentioned before, and we'll get into a little bit later too, is where a lot of that security governance role is sitting. But even thinking about it, what is the security function, right? We hear a lot about how at its root, it's a risk management function. Because we want to ensure that whatever we're spending or whatever we're doing is buying down the risk appropriately, but also that we're not spending $1 million to protect $10,000. And thinking of it even as a technical discipline is really changing now, in my view, and moving largely to governance. But my point is, if people that do this for a living, one of the things with security is people tend to think about it not just on the job, right? I have friends that are accountants, and they're not researching accounting in the evening, right? They're not going to accounting conferences on the weekends. Nobody has shirts about, some accounting technology, unless they get it free at a conference they use to wash their car. But if we're people that think about this all the time and debate it, what does that mean for the overall industry, right? What does that mean for people outside of security when they're thinking about it? How are they going to define it? And so one way to look at it is to think about what is the outcome that we want, right? What is the actual role? And you start to look at why we do security and what parts of security matter, and then think about who else is involved, right, and where it could be. Again, so much of security and what security deals with has become legal topics now, right? I mean, who works in IR? How often is legal involved in that? How many things that we do from a security perspective are driven by contractual obligations. Privacy, years ago, I used to think privacy was going to overtake security and that we should all get privacy jobs. Of course, I was wrong. Just like when I wrote a blog about how the iPad would not be a success when it first came out. And I'm glad that can't find that on the internet now, thank God. So I'm wrong about plenty of things. But even the audit function, right? My wife is an IT auditor. And so, looking at what she does, and she's getting more and more into security and risk. And that's starting to move largely into the security domains. And even from an HR perspective, not just acceptable use policies, but a lot of access management, or even finance, right? Because what happens, how much of security is again, contractually based and has to do with, payouts and who's responsible for a breach and everything else. Obviously, general IT has continued to, I think, expand into the security domain. And procurement. Procurement's one of my favorite topics, third-party risk management. When I was giving my presentation yesterday to the insurance groups, we talked a little bit about third-party due diligence. But the problem is, if you watch the news, right, what's been happening with a lot of really big companies? A lot of big third-party companies. They've been getting breached, right? And they've been causing incidents. And the challenge is that just about all of them would have passed any third-party assessment with flying colors, right? They have all the certificates. They can fill out all those forms you want. And it's becoming more difficult. And I think the procurement process in general is a really good example of where in the different processes and programs at any organization, security ends up fitting. And I think this further kind of helps my argument that a lot of these security roles and functions can, and in the future will, fall to general IT, but with some kind of oversight from a security governance function. So one of the things that's extremely important for us is obviously carrying the message, right? So how often do you hear that security is everyone's responsibility, right? All the time. But is it, right? If I'm allowed to drive the company truck to make deliveries, it's my job to not drive it recklessly, right? I should report it if, something seems off. But is it my job, if I'm driving the company truck, to get underneath that truck and check the brakes and, look at the way the frame is set up or anything like that? No, I should be given some kind of safe-to-drive vehicle. And I think that's something else that's going to continue to change. It's very easy to blame people that, end up being ultimately responsible for these issues. But you start to think about it, you see a lot of victim blaming, is that it's not up to us, right, to know every nuance of accounting or finance or human resources, but we expect a lot of people to know a lot of the elements of security that they may not know. People get annoyed with me when I say it too, though, but if Bob in accounting can click one thing and take down our entire company, that's probably something of an IT issue or a security issue. So moving along, I think one of the most important things as well is to understand the organization. And I think that's going to continue to inform how we look at security programs and how we look at the responsibility for security. In the old days, security used to be the party of no, right? Somebody's older, you probably used to hear that all the time. And I think that what I've seen is it started to morph into, a lot of times security likes to get to zero risk. But we're not the FAA, right? You don't make money taking no risks. The FAA is fascinating. My kids are young, and so they don't worry about me flying. When my dad used to travel all the time, I used to be really nervous when he traveled, right? Because planes would fall out of the sky a couple times a year, right? It was a legitimate thing as a kid I worried about. But my kids are 16, 12, and 2, and they cannot fundamentally understand that it's possible for a domestic commercial airliner to crash, right? And that's because the FAA, and this is probably a worse example given everything in the news, but if a plane crashes, they'll go out, they'll get every part off the bottom of the ocean, reassemble it, figure out what happened, and then they'll go out and fix that issue on all the planes, right? Well, we can't do that, right? We'd never be able to function as businesses and organizations. So understanding kind of the risk management and understanding the risks that organizations need to take and implementing those into our security program is going to continue to be essential. And I think it's another one of the reasons that we'll continue to see security functions and security oversight move out of just a specific security role and into the broader organization, into the broader management organization. Another point I like to make is audit and regulators can be your best friends. You know, in the old days, so much of security was based on compliance requirements. People used to hate it, right? They'd talk about, you know, security is not compliance or vice versa. But how many times did we see organizations that built a security program because they had to, or implemented security controls because they had to? It was extremely common. So I remember at a different BSides, at BSides Cleveland, somebody much smarter than I am was on a panel, and she was talking about, you know, would you rather have a software security team or developers that write secure code? I would pick the second, right? I mean, you still need oversight. You still need to check your applications, everything else. But this is one of the reasons when we talk about kind of the overall topic of security governance, people always ask me, how many security FTEs should I have? I don't know, right? Because I don't know who your FTEs are. Because I'm sure there are people in this room that probably know 15 different technologies and can go in and assess and implement any one of those. And then there are others of us, right? I don't know that I could assess or implement any 15 technologies, right? I mean, I'm a governance guy. I don't, you know. And so looking at that and starting to understand, you know, how we're able to hire, especially for specialized roles, and even defining whether these roles, you know, should even be in security, I think is going to continue to be essential. You know, one of the questions, even from a firewall admin perspective, so when you're counting your security FTEs, is that a security role? If they're implementing or if they're designing, right? Or if they're testing. And I think this is going to become an even bigger issue, right? Because does anybody right now have an open checkbook to hire? Right? Companies are slowing down their hiring, and so they're looking for more value. And I think in the same way that people are looking at the tools that they have in their environment and trying to understand if they're making the most use of them, it's going to continue to have organizations looking to give more and more of their currently specialized roles to more generalist roles. So in the old days, all anyone ever talked about was what? Breaches, right? We talked about Target or Heartland or what have you. And remember you used to have all those big bubble charts, right, that would show the different size of breach data and so on and so forth. And one of the things I used to think about, you know, 10 or 15 years ago, especially as an interview question, is if you were hiring somebody into a security program, I would like to ask them, if you had a manufacturer with no compliance requirements and no real intellectual property that they're particularly worried about, how would you sell them on a security program? Right? As a thought exercise, it used to be really difficult. And now it's extremely simple because it's all about availability, right? So if you think about the news stories, how many of them are about availability these days? You know, we're in a casino right now. You know, somebody my age, it still blows me away that the internet being unavailable means I can't check into my hotel room. I mean, that still feels crazy to me. But availability has become a much bigger issue, and one of the things that you know, we've been talking about constantly. So again, kind of looking at the future. So I went out and I just did a Google search for crystal ball royalty-free. So I work in information security, but my passion is graphic design. It's like my side thing. But you know, one of the things that we keep hearing is, you know, organizations for years have been very willing to spend a ton of money on security, right? They bought a ton of tools. They spent a lot of money in a lot of different areas. And what's happened? Have incidents and breaches gone up or down? Gone way up, right? I mean, any of us with the news. And you know, with contracts and insurance and availability issues, it's going to continue to get you know, more of an issue. And organizations, I think a lot of them are looking at it as if they feel like they're going to get breached at some point, and so the old, if it's not if, it's when, and looking to ensure that they have the lawyers on hand to handle it, even more so than the technical staff. So I think that we're going to continue, that's going to continue to drive the ways that we think about things and structure things. Anybody know what this is? And so this is an image that I like to use, right? And it's not about IT in general. It's not that, every day is the same and we're constantly running towards a goal that seems to be constantly pulled away like Charlie Brown in the football. I like this because if I go out and buy a treadmill right now, right, and I plop it down in front of my TV, am I in shape? I'm not in shape, right? And what if I leave that treadmill sitting there for 6 months, right? Am I in shape? Still not in shape, right? You have to actually use it. And this is an image that I like to use when talking about a lot of the different security tools that are out there. Because it's pretty common that tools are not being used effectively or we're not using all the capabilities. Feel free to steal that one, or not. But when thinking about future security programs, it's easy to look at it and say, that's not going to happen, or what have you. But look at the environment. Are we able to find people anyway, right? When you look at the issue of kind of the skills gap or the hiring gap, it's that organizations are looking for people that can hit the ground running and have expertise in multiple domains, and they don't necessarily exist right now. And when we continue to see the specialization, it becomes even more difficult. And so many of the roles, I think, are becoming duplicative, right? So, you see a train, right? Trains used to have cabooses, right? They used to have an extra person riding in the caboose. And now there's just 2 engineers or maybe even 1. They're talking about getting rid of like 2 pilots in the cockpit. So organizations are looking to have fewer and fewer people that are doing more and more. And I think one of the ways to look at that is not just upskilling, right? So upskilling, thinking of taking people that have not worked in IT or not worked in security and bringing them in. But I think also cross-skilling, right? So training our current IT staff and our current IT teams to continue to learn security and implement things securely. So one of the things, what should be in-house, again, is a grain of salt. I work in consulting, as a third party, but it really depends on the size of your organization. You think about what's your IR plan. Well, I like to think about it like I think about my house, right? What's my fire plan? My fire plan is, well, I'll use the fire extinguisher a little bit, but then I'm just going to call the fire department, right? That's my plan, right? There's some people that might have their own fire department. But at least looking at and determining what should be in-house and how big and complex these things need to be is going to be essential. What can you outsource? What can just be picking up the phone? And as we continue to kind of look at these distributed security functions and thinking about what is the actual outcome that we're interested in having, right? What do we actually want to accomplish and what is our end goal? Oftentimes from that perspective, we get misaligned as security teams. But is the outcome, is our goal based on the business realities? Is it based on the risk? And are we thinking about how to get to that outcome in the end? So if you think about it, what we're doing as a security strategy, how does that align with the overall business strategy? So I like to let people read this and see if they laugh. But I'm getting like no laughs today, so such is life, right? But even thinking about it, right, with all these different technologies, the cloud, right, I work with someone named Paul Sams, who's one of the smartest guys I know. And he always describes the cloud as kind of insecure by default, right? The way that it's shipped, it's not set up for security necessarily. And so a lot of organizations will just let it sit as it is. And as we get more and more specialized, I was out at a Fortune 100 company, and it was during the summer, and we were having lunch, and there were like 3 different tables. And sometimes you can just tell that people kind of are sticking together. And I was like, oh, what team is that? They're like, oh, those are our consultants, right? They had a whole team of consultants from the outside coming in to work on a specific technology because it was really impossible to hire 40 people that knew it. So I think that's going to continue to happen, right? We're going to start to have a lot of people that are outsourced and working on these functions. So again, this is one of my least popular opinions, but I too read Twitter or X or whatever we call it these days. Like Vanessa Williams, I saved the best for last. Oh, God, man, this is a really rough crowd. Like, I usually, even if people get nothing out of it, at least they laugh a few times, and that's what they remember, if nothing else. But I'm not going to have that today, so that's unfortunate for me. But I really do think, this is probably my biggest point. I actually saw an article recently about it a couple weeks ago. I think it was CIO magazine or CISO magazine or one of those magazines that's very specialized. But it was about how this is becoming more and more of a conversation. And just that, the security role, again, is so based on contractual obligations and reporting and legislation and everything else, that it's just likely to be a role that is kind of more business-based and supported by a technical security director. So this is absolutely my best slide. As I mentioned, I'm a graphic design enthusiast. But again, we can't predict the future, but whatever it is going to be interesting. The industry is so different now than it was 10 years ago, and I think 10 years from now, it's going to continue to change and be much more different than it is today. But as always, be good to each other, and I left about 5 minutes for questions if anybody has any. Yes?
Weren't you that guy that fell off that stage?
I am that guy that fell off that stage, and it's still... So I'll tell you one other story, right? So every time I end up speaking in Pittsburgh, I'm always somewhere else that week. And so I always end up flying home on Thursday night and then driving out on Friday. And so I was out here, I forget which conference it was, but it was at the Rivers. And there were about 600 people there. And I think it was just one track at the time I was speaking, which was 4 o'clock. And I was all excited. And then they went and they put the CPE certificates out right on the table at 3. And I was speaking at 4. And so I walk into that big room, and I'm standing there, and there were 7 people, right? In a room that held 400 people. 7 people is fine, but in a room that holds 400, that's terrible, right? That's just upsetting. And the even better part of those 7 is 4 are people that I work with. Right? And so I didn't even know what to do. So I just, one of them, it's my friend named Chris Bash. He was there, and he was super, he knew the situation, and he knows how high-strung I am and how upset I would be by that. So he was just yeah, you know what I mean, cheering me on the whole time. So at least there weren't 7 people here. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you, everybody, very much.